The hall was full, lights glowing on every side, cameras waiting, and people whispering. Everyone had come to hear the words of Keanu Reeves. They were not just fans, they were people from every walk of life sitting close together, holding their breath. They expected a speech, maybe a story from Hollywood, maybe a joke, maybe something about movies. But when Keanu stepped onto the stage, he did not speak. He only looked at the crowd, his eyes calm, his face soft, and his silence made the hall heavy with emotion. At first, some thought he was nervous. Others thought he was waiting for a microphone to work. But the mic was fine. Keanu stood in that silence, letting it grow bigger. And the more he stayed quiet, the more people leaned forward, the more their hearts began to beat with curiosity. What could he be holding back? What truth was too heavy for simple words? A young boy in the front row whispered to his mother, "Why is he not talking?" She held his hand and said, "Sometimes silence tells more than words." That single moment created suspense that spread across the hall like a wave. And then, after almost 3 minutes, Keanu took a deep breath and finally spoke. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the hardest thing to do is not acting in a film, not facing the cameras, not learning a fight scene. The hardest thing is to face your own life when it gives you pain you never asked for." The hall went still. Even those holding phones stopped recording for a second. Because his voice was not acting, it was truth. He shared that his silence was not empty. He carried memories that shaped his soul. He told the hall how life had tested him in ways no script could ever write. He had lost friends too early, family too soon, and dreams that never had a chance to shine. But through that silence he found respect, humility, and kindness. His words were simple, but they cut deep. He said, "People think of success as cars, fame, money, and red carpets. But what I learned is that real success is when you can look at another human being and give them kindness, even if your own heart is broken." The crowd began to shift. Some had tears in their eyes already. Keanu had not started with power. He had started with pain. And pain is what makes every person in the world equal. Just when the audience thought it would be a speech about sadness, Keanu smiled gently. "But let me tell you," he said, "the story does not end in sadness. I stayed silent because I wanted you to feel the same thing I felt for many years. Silence that carries pain, silence that holds memories, silence that weighs heavy. But then, something changed." He paused again, and people leaned even closer. "One day, I realized silence could also carry love. When you sit with someone you care about, you do not always need to talk. When you walk next to a friend, you do not always need to explain. Silence can be healing. Silence can be respect. Silence can be peace." The hall filled with a different kind of energy now. Instead of heaviness, there was lightness, as if people had been holding a stone on their chest and it was slowly being lifted. Keanu then opened up about his personal struggles. He did not hide behind fame. He spoke of days when he did not want to get out of bed, when he felt the world had taken too much from him. "I thought I would not survive," he admitted. "I thought I would break. But the strange thing is, life does not ask if you are ready. It keeps moving, and you either move with it or you stay trapped." He told them how he chose to move, even when it hurt. He chose to work, to meet people, to smile at strangers, even when inside he was breaking. "And what I learned," he said, "is that sometimes giving kindness to others is the only way to save yourself." People in the hall nodded. Some were whispering, some were wiping tears. They had expected a movie star, but they found a mirror to their own lives. Keanu looked at a man in the third row who had his head down. "You," he said softly, "I can see you are hurting. But let me tell you something. I was you once. I sat where you are, thinking no one would understand. But trust me, someone will. Someone always will. And if you cannot find that person, then be that person for someone else." The man lifted his eyes, shocked that Keanu had noticed him in a crowd of hundreds. This moment broke the barrier between stage and audience. It was no longer a speech. It was no longer a performance. It was a conversation between souls. After this, Keanu went silent again. But this time, the silence felt different. It was not heavy anymore, it was warm. People felt it like sunlight on their skin. It was silence that carried hope, silence that told them they were not alone. And everyone waited, knowing the next words he would speak could change the way they saw their own lives. The silence stretched again, but this time people did not feel anxious. They felt connected. It was like a thread tying each heart in the hall together. Some were waiting for him to share more of his struggles. Others thought he might finally tell a story that nobody had heard before. Then Keanu spoke again, his voice steady but softer than before. When I was younger, I used to think pain was a punishment. I thought if something bad happened to me, it meant I had done something wrong, that maybe I deserved it. But the truth is, life does not punish. Life simply teaches. And sometimes the lessons are so hard, they break you first, and then they rebuild you in a way you never imagined. A woman in the crowd nodded slowly, as if those words were written directly for her. Her husband had passed only months ago, and she had come to the event hoping for a distraction. Instead, she found comfort. Keanu paused, looked around the hall, and then said something that surprised everyone. I once lost someone I loved, and I thought I could not go on. The silence after that loss was louder than any noise I had ever heard. It followed me everywhere. When I walked in my house, when I sat in my car, even when I was surrounded by people, that silence was still there. He looked down for a moment as if reliving the memory, and the audience held its breath. But then I realized something, he continued. The silence was not empty. It carried their presence. It carried every laugh we shared, every smile, every moment that meant something. I understood that silence was a reminder, not of what I lost, but of the love that once existed, and that love was not gone. It had only changed its form. People shifted in their seats, wiping tears quietly, careful not to break the sacred atmosphere that had formed in the hall. Then a young man stood up in the back, his voice trembling. But what if the silence is too much? What if it is too heavy? Everyone turned, shocked by his courage to speak. But Keanu smiled gently at him. If the silence is too heavy, he said, share it. Share it with a friend, a stranger, even with the world. When you let someone else carry it with you, it becomes lighter. That is what I am doing right now. I am sharing mine with you, and it no longer feels like a burden. It feels like connection. The audience clapped softly. Not loud applause, but a gentle sound of respect. Keanu raised his hand for them to stop and whispered, "Let me tell you something even deeper. Silence is not only about loss. Silence is also about listening. The world is full of noise. People shout, people argue, people fight to be heard. But in the noise, we forget to listen. Silence is the space where listening becomes real. And when you truly listen, you understand others in a way that words can never give." He then told a small story. Once, years ago, he had been sitting in a park, quietly, just watching the sky. A stranger sat next to him. They did not talk for almost an hour. But when the stranger stood to leave, he looked at Keanu and said, "Thank you. I have not felt this peaceful in years." They had not exchanged a single word, yet something had passed between them. "This is the power of silence," Keanu explained. "Sometimes it is the greatest gift you can offer to another soul." The hall felt lighter now. People smiled at one another, strangers exchanging looks of understanding. It was as if Keanu had built a bridge between every person in the room. But then came the unexpected twist. Keanu leaned closer to the microphone and said, "But silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is a weapon. Sometimes people will stay silent when you need them most, and that silence will cut deeper than any word. I know what that feels like. When you cry for help and no one answers. When you look for comfort and all you hear is silence. It hurts." His voice broke slightly, and the audience leaned forward in shock. "Yet, even then," he continued, "you can turn that silence into strength. You can take that empty space and fill it with your own courage. Because if no one speaks for you, then you must learn to speak for yourself. And that is when you discover the strength you never knew you had." A wave of quiet agreement moved across the hall. People were no longer just listeners. They were participants in a journey. Keanu looked around and his eyes softened again. I want to ask all of you something. Think of the last time you gave someone silence, not out of care but out of anger, out of pride, out of coldness. Maybe it was a friend you ignored, maybe a family member you refused to call. Do you know what that silence felt like to them? Do you know what it cost them? The crowd shifted uncomfortably. He had touched something raw. Change that, he said firmly. If you can speak, then speak. If you can comfort, then comfort. Silence can be love, but it can also be neglect. Choose what kind of silence you give. There was no applause now, only deep thought. People sat with their hands in their laps, reflecting, realizing. Then Keanu gave a small smile and whispered, I stayed silent tonight because I wanted you to feel what silence can do. It can make you restless. It can make you reflect. It can make you connect. Now imagine if you lived your whole life without breaking that silence. What stories would remain untold? What kindness would remain unspoken? What love would remain hidden? Do not let that happen. He stepped back slightly, letting his words sink in. The hall was quiet again. But now everyone understood that this quietness had purpose. And just when they thought he had given all of himself, Keanu leaned forward and revealed that there was one story he had never shared with anyone before. Not even the media, everyone froze. The suspense was unbearable. The room held its breath. Cameras stayed still. Even the lights seemed frozen, as if the world itself wanted to hear what Keanu was about to say. He looked down for a moment, then slowly lifted his eyes, and in them people saw something raw, something unguarded. I once carried a story inside me that I never shared, he said quietly, because I was afraid people would not understand. I was afraid they would only see me as an actor, not as a human being. But tonight, I want to trust you with it, because maybe, just maybe, it will help someone here. The audience leaned in, their hearts beating faster. Years ago, Keanu began, I was walking home late one night. I had just finished filming. I was tired, my body was aching, and my mind was heavy. As I walked, I saw a man sitting on the cold ground, his head down, his clothes worn, his hands trembling. Most people passed him without a glance. But something inside me stopped. He paused, his voice trembling with memory. I sat next to him. I did not speak at first. We just sat in silence. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then he lifted his eyes, and I saw pain I could not describe. He told me he had lost everything. Family, friends, home, work. He said the world had gone silent for him. Nobody called his name anymore. Nobody asked how he was. He felt invisible. The hall was completely silent. Keanu continued, That night, I listened. I did not judge. I did not offer false hope. I simply listened. And when he finished, I gave him the little money I had with me, and I told him, You are not invisible. I see you. I hear you. You matter. His eyes filled with tears. But what shocked me was not his tears. It was his smile. It was the smile of a man who had been given back his own worth. A woman in the audience covered her face, sobbing quietly. Keanu looked around the hall and said, I never saw that man again. I do not know what happened to him, but I learned something that night. Sometimes you do not need to save someone's life. Sometimes you just need to give them a reason to believe they still have one. The audience sat stunned. They had come for a speech, but what they were receiving was a confession, a piece of Keanu's heart. He then added softly, And let me tell you something. I was not the hero that night. He saved me. Because until then, I had been drowning in my own silence. I had been carrying losses I could not share, pain I could not explain. But when I listened to him, I realized I was not alone. His story became my mirror, and suddenly my silence felt lighter. It turned into strength. A wave of emotion swept across the hall. People felt their own hidden stories rising inside them, stories they had buried for years. A young girl raised her hand, her voice shaking as she asked, But how do you carry silence without letting it destroy you? Keanu smiled gently. You carry it by turning it into kindness. You carry it by making sure your silence never becomes someone else's loneliness. You carry it by sharing it in moments like this so that others know they are not alone. That is how silence becomes power. The audience clapped, not in loud excitement, but in deep respect. Then Keanu's face grew serious again. "But I need to warn you about something," he said. "There are times when silence is dangerous. When people see injustice, when they see cruelty, and they choose to stay silent. That kind of silence allows darkness to grow. I have seen it, and I have felt it. And if you ever face such a moment, do not let fear keep you silent. Speak. Because silence in the face of cruelty is not peace, it is betrayal." His words cut through the hall like lightning. He stepped forward, his voice firmer now. "Do not confuse humility with silence when it comes to standing up for what is right. Respect, kindness, and resilience do not mean you hide your voice. It means you use your voice to lift others, to defend the weak, to bring light where there is shadow." A sudden burst of applause broke out, louder this time, stronger, as if the audience could no longer contain their emotions. Keanu waited for it to fade. Then he leaned into the microphone again and whispered, "And this is why I stayed silent when I walked onto this stage. Because I wanted you to feel it first before I explained it. I wanted you to know the weight, the unease, the suspense. Now you understand. Silence is not empty. It is full of meaning. You just have to decide what meaning you will give it." The audience was overwhelmed, but Keanu was not done yet. He took a deep breath, and his eyes grew darker with memory. "There is still one more silence I must tell you about," he said slowly. "A silence that nearly broke me. A silence I thought I would never survive." The hall froze again. The tension returned, sharper than before. Nobody moved, nobody whispered. They knew he was about to reveal something even more personal, something that could change the way they saw him forever. The hall was still, like the world itself was holding its breath. Keanu lowered his eyes, and for a moment it looked as if he might not speak at all. Then, in a quiet voice that carried through every corner of the room, he said, "There was a silence that almost destroyed me. It came after I lost the person I thought I would spend my life with." The crowd felt a heavy weight fall over them. When love is taken from you suddenly, it is not only the person you lose. You lose the sound of their voice, the warmth of their presence, the way they filled the air around you. The silence they leave behind is louder than any noise in the world. I would wake up at night and listen, but there was nothing. I would sit in the kitchen waiting for a sound, but there was nothing. I thought I would never escape that silence. His words pierced through the audience. Many had felt this pain, but hearing it from him made it even more real. "I wanted to run from it," he continued, "but silence follows you everywhere. You cannot escape it. And so I learned the hardest lesson of my life. If you cannot escape the silence, you must make peace with it. You must turn it into something that carries love instead of loss." A woman in the front row wiped her tears. A man squeezed his wife's hand tightly. People were breaking inside, yet they felt stronger because he was breaking with them. Keanu's voice grew softer. I began to remember the little things. The way she laughed at the smallest joke. The way she looked at the rain like it was magic. The way her silence was never empty when she sat next to me. I realized I could keep those things alive. I could turn the silence into memory, and memory into gratitude. I could thank life for letting me love, even if the time was short, and that gratitude saved me. His words did not just land in the hall, they settled into people's hearts like seeds. Then he lifted his eyes again, and there was fire in them now. "But let me tell you something important. Grief never disappears. Do not let anyone tell you that time erases it. What happens is different. Grief becomes part of you, like a scar that never leaves but stops hurting when you touch it. And that scar is proof that love was real. Do not be ashamed of it. Carry it with honor." The hall was quiet, but it was no longer heavy. It was respectful, almost sacred. A young woman suddenly stood and said with trembling words, "I lost my brother last year, I thought I was weak because I still cry. But now I see maybe it is not weakness. Keanu looked at her with deep kindness. It is not weakness, he said softly. Tears are proof of love, and love is never weak. The audience could no longer hold back. Many began to cry openly, some leaning on the shoulders of strangers beside them. After a moment, Keanu raised his hand gently to calm the room. Do you know why I'm telling you all this tonight? Because silence, grief, loss, these are things people hide. We pretend to be strong, we pretend to be fine. But pretending only makes the silence heavier. When we share it, it becomes lighter. When we share it, it turns into strength. He walked a few steps across the stage, his hands folded. I stayed silent for years, thinking the world did not need my pain. But the truth is, when you share your pain, you give someone else the courage to share theirs. And then both of you heal a little faster. The audience nodded. Many had their eyes closed, absorbing his words like medicine. Then Keanu's tone shifted again, gentle but firm. Yet there is another kind of silence we must talk about. The silence we keep with ourselves. The silence of our own thoughts. Sometimes that silence is filled with doubt, anger, fear. Sometimes it tells us lies, that we are not enough, that we do not matter. I have heard those lies many times in my own head. But here is the truth. Those lies do not belong to you. They are the echoes of your pain, not the voice of your soul. Your soul is stronger, kinder, and braver than you think. The hall erupted in applause, this time stronger than ever. Keanu let the sound wash over him. But when it calmed, he leaned into the microphone again and whispered. The soul speaks in silence, and if you listen closely, you will hear it say, "Keep going, keep living, keep loving." The audience was deeply moved. Some clutched their chests, others nodded with closed eyes, letting the words sink into their bones. But then Keanu's voice grew darker again, almost like a warning. But I must tell you something else. Silence can also hide secrets. Secrets that change lives, secrets that hurt when they come out. I know this because I carried one myself for years, afraid of what would happen if I spoke it. The suspense returned instantly. Every person in the hall sat straighter, waiting, knowing he was about to uncover something powerful. Keanu lowered his voice and said, "Tonight, I think it is time to share that secret, because truth only heals when it is spoken." The crowd froze. The weight of anticipation pressed down on everyone. This was no longer just a talk. It was a revelation in the making. The hall was so quiet that even a falling pin would have sounded like thunder. People leaned forward, their eyes fixed on Keanu, waiting for the secret he had promised to reveal. His face was calm, but his eyes carried storms that had waited for years to break. "I carried this silence for too long," he said slowly. "It was not about movies, not about fame, not about work. It was about life itself. Years ago, when I was at the peak of my career, when the world thought I had everything, inside, I was breaking apart. I smiled in interviews, I posed for pictures, I acted in films, but when I returned home, I was alone with my silence. I told no one how close I came to giving up. I told no one how heavy the nights were." His words cut through the room like a blade. People think strength means you never fall. But the truth is, real strength is when you fall and still decide to stand again. I was so close to losing that fight. I thought of leaving it all behind, leaving the noise, leaving the world. I thought silence would protect me, but it nearly destroyed me. Gasps echoed across the hall. Many held their breath, shocked by his openness. "But then something happened," he continued, his voice trembling. "One day I met a child outside a theater. She had waited for hours just to see me. When I finally came out, she smiled and said, 'You saved me when I felt alone.' She was only 10 years old, but her words changed me. I thought I was the one carrying silence, but in that moment I realized my work, my presence, my story had spoken to her louder than my silence ever could. I realized I could not give up, because if my life could help even one person, then it was worth living." The crowd broke into soft claps, some crying openly. Keanu raised his hand gently and whispered, "I want you to hear me clearly tonight. Silence can destroy, but it can also save. It depends on what you do with it. I survived because I decided to turn my silence into a voice, not for me, but for others. And if you are sitting here tonight with heavy silence in your heart, let me tell you, you are not alone. And your story matters more than you think." The hall was trembling with emotion now. People were not just listening, they were living the story with him. Then Keanu paused, looked down, and smiled softly. There is another side to silence, too. Sometimes silence is love. I remember once, years ago, I was sitting with a friend. We did not speak for hours. We just sat watching the world go by. But that silence was full of trust. It was full of peace. You do not always need words to say you care. Sometimes silence says it better. He lifted his head again, his voice clear. So I ask you tonight, think about your own silence. Is it a silence that heals or a silence that hurts? Do not let it become a prison. Make it a bridge. The audience erupted in applause, louder than before, some standing now, unable to contain their emotions. But Keanu raised his hand once again. The room grew quiet, and he leaned close to the microphone. There is one more thing I must tell you. Silence hides something in all of us. Sometimes it hides pain. Sometimes it hides love. Sometimes it hides truth we are too afraid to say. But tonight I will not hide. I will tell you the truth I never dared to speak before. He stopped and looked around, his eyes shining in the bright lights. The suspense was unbearable. "The truth is," he said slowly, "I learned the value of silence from someone who once gave me the greatest gift of all. It was not money, it was not fame, it was not power. It was a moment of kindness that saved me when I was at my lowest. And that kindness came from a person nobody knew, a stranger whose face I still remember." The audience was frozen, desperate to hear more. Keanu's voice grew softer, almost a whisper. That stranger spoke no words. They only placed their hand on my shoulder when I was sitting alone, ready to give up. They gave me silence, but it was the kind of silence that says, "I see you, I am here, you matter." That single moment changed me forever. It taught me that even silence can shout the loudest truth, that none of us are truly alone. A wave of emotion swept across the hall again. Many people cried freely now, no longer hiding their tears. Keanu stood taller, his presence strong. That is the secret I kept, that the smallest act of kindness, even in silence, can save a life. I know, because it saved mine. And if it saved me, it can save you too. Never underestimate the power of kindness, even when it comes without words. The audience stood in thunderous applause, their hearts broken open, their spirits lifted. But Keanu was not finished. He held up his hand, waiting for quiet once more, and said, "And yet, there is still one silence I have not told you about, the silence that taught me the greatest lesson of all." The room froze again. The suspense returned, sharper than before. Every heart waited for the next revelation, knowing it would be deeper than anything he had shared so far. The hall was trembling with quiet. Every person waited, not daring to move, not daring to break the stillness. Keanu looked across the sea of faces, and his eyes softened as if he carried their pain and his own at the same time. Then he spoke, his voice low but steady. "The silence that taught me the greatest lesson was not outside me. It was inside me. It was the silence that came when I stopped running, when I stopped hiding, when I finally sat alone with myself. For years I had filled my life with work, with noise, with movement. I thought if I stayed busy, the silence could never catch me. But it always did. It waited in the corners. It waited at night. It waited when the cameras were gone. And one day I realized I had to face it." He paused, and the crowd leaned forward. "I sat with that silence for hours, for days. I let it speak to me. I let it tell me all the things I had been avoiding. It told me about my grief. It told me about my fears. It told me about the parts of me I wanted to forget. It was the hardest thing I ever did. But in that silence, I found something else. I found myself. The audience sat in awe. We spend our lives running from silence, but silence is where truth lives. Silence is where we meet our real selves. And when you meet yourself, when you accept yourself, then no pain, no loss, no darkness can ever take that away. That was the greatest lesson I learned. Silence is not an enemy. Silence is the doorway to your soul. A wave of emotion moved through the hall like a storm breaking into light. People held their faces, some sobbing openly, others whispering prayers or words of thanks. Keanu's voice grew stronger now. And once you know this, you carry it into the world. You use it. You give silence as comfort to others. You break silence when it becomes cruelty. You turn silence into kindness, into love, into peace. That is how we survive. That is how we live. That is how we honor those we lost, and how we protect those we still have. The hall erupted into applause, but Keanu did not step back. He raised his hand and brought the room to quiet once more. "Let me leave you with this," he said. "When I first stood on this stage, I stayed silent and you felt restless. Now, after everything, we can sit together in silence and feel peace. That is the power of what we share. Tonight, you gave me your silence, and I gave you mine. May you leave here knowing that silence is never empty. It is full of everything that matters: love, respect, resilience, and kindness." He bowed his head. The hall stood in thunderous applause, people rising to their feet, clapping, cheering, some crying, some holding each other. The silence had turned into the loudest, most powerful sound of all: human hearts beating together in hope. And as Keanu stepped away from the microphone, his face calm, his eyes gentle, the people in that hall knew they had witnessed something they would never forget. The silence he had carried became their silence too, and together they had turned it into strength.